Dear friends, after a tiring day, welcome to the mysterious sleep tales, where the ancient world opens with whispers and the boundaries between wakefulness and dream soften as the twilight mist. I am your guide on these mysterious, forgotten, and forever enigmatic nocturnal journeys. Tonight, as the silence of your evening settles, we invite you to walk along the banks of one of the world's most legendary waterways, to meet a guardian with a lineage spanning generations, and to discover the secret that has bound the living and the dead for centuries. Let the outside world disappear. Let her breath slow. And let us begin our journey to the Yellow River, where lanterns shine like falling stars on ancient waters and a solitary watchman keeps a vigil as old as Chinese civilization itself. Part 1. The River's Ancient Song. The Yellow River stretches across northern China like a massive dragon of living water, its body winding through 9 provinces over a distance of 3,395 miles. From its source high in the Bayan Mountains of the Tibetan Plateau, where the air is thin and the peaks scrape the underbelly of heaven, the river begins its journey as a series of crystal springs bubbling forth from the frozen earth. These springs gather into streams, and the streams into torrents, and the torrents into a mighty flow that will eventually empty into the Bohai Sea, carrying with it the stories of 5,000 years of human civilization. In those early miles, high in Qinghai province, the water runs clear and cold. It passes through 2 vast lakes, Yingering and Jiring, each covering roughly 400 square miles, their surfaces freezing solid in winter and teeming with fish when a brief summer thaws the ice. Here, the river is gentle, almost contemplative, as if gathering strength for the long journey ahead. Tibetan herders water their yaks along its banks, and the prayer flags they string across the landscape flutter blessings onto the passing current. But as the river descends from the plateau, passing through the provinces of Sichuan and Gansu, entering the vast loop through Inner Mongolia and bending south between Shaanxi and Shaanxi, something transformative occurs. The Yellow River cuts through the Lus Plateau, a landscape of wind-blown sediment accumulated over millions of years, layer upon layer of fine yellow-brown silt that gives the region its name. This Lus, soft and easily eroded, pours into the river in staggering quantities. Every cubic foot of water comes to carry more than 2 pounds of this fine sediment, turning the clear mountain stream into a thick, yellow-brown torrent that churns and roils with the weight of earth it bears. This is how the river earned its name, Huanghe in Mandarin, the Yellow River. But it has earned other names as well, names that speak to its complex relationship with the people who have lived along its banks for millennia. They call it the Mother River, for it nourished the earliest Chinese civilizations, providing water for crops, fish for food, and a highway for trade and communication. The fertile plains along its middle and lower reaches became the cradle of Chinese culture, where agriculture first took root, where cities first rose, where writing first emerged, where dynasties first consolidated their power. But they also call it China's sorrow, a name heavy with the memory of catastrophe. The same sediment that enriched the farmland also created one of the most dangerous hydrological phenomena on Earth. As the river flowed across the North China Plain and its lower reaches, its current slowed and the sediment began to settle, building up the riverbed year by year, century by century. To protect their homes and fields from flooding, people built levees along the banks, containing the river between earthen walls. But as the riverbed rose, they had to build the levees higher. And as the levees grew higher, the riverbed rose further still. Over time, this created an impossible situation. The Yellow River came to flow above the surrounding countryside, held in place only by levees that sometimes rose 30 or 40 feet above the adjacent farmland. When these levees broke, as they inevitably did during periods of heavy rain or rapid snowmelt, the consequences were apocalyptic. The water would burst through the breach and spread across thousands of square miles of densely populated plains, unable to drain back into the river because the riverbed now sat higher than the land itself. These floods destroyed entire cities, drowned hundreds of thousands of people, created famines that killed millions more, and sometimes forced the river into an entirely new course, with its mouth shifting as much as 300 miles north or south over the centuries. Historical records document more than 1,500 breaches and floods in the lower Yellow River over the past 3,000 years, and more than 20 major course changes. The most recent deliberate flooding occurred in 1938 during the Second Sino-Japanese War, when nationalist forces broke the levees near Huayuankou in Hunan province, hoping to slow the Japanese advance. The resulting flood covered an area of nearly 21,000 square miles and claimed between 500,000 and 900,000 Chinese lives, along with an unknown number of Japanese soldiers. It stands as one of the greatest human-caused disasters in history. Yet despite this history of destruction, or perhaps because of it, the Yellow River holds a sacred place in Chinese consciousness. It is inextricably linked with the idea of China itself, with Chinese identity, with the concept of civilization emerging from the interplay between human ingenuity and natural forces, both benevolent and terrible. To understand China, one must understand the Yellow River. To understand the Chinese people, one must understand their relationship with this water that has both nurtured and destroyed them across the millennia. In the earliest days, when tribal peoples first settled along the riverbanks during the Neolithic period, they viewed the river as a living entity, possessed of its own will, its own moods, its own divine essence. They made offerings to the river spirits, seeking to appease them during flood season and to thank them for bountiful harvests. Archaeological evidence from sites like Yangshao and Longshan shows sophisticated ritual objects, ceramic vessels decorated with flowing water patterns, and graves oriented to face the river, suggesting a spiritual relationship between the living, the dead, and the eternal flow of water. As these scattered settlements coalesced into the first Chinese states, the river remained central to their mythology and political legitimacy. The legendary Sage King Yu the Great, founder of the Xia dynasty around 2100 years before the Common Era, earned his position through his success in controlling the Yellow River's floods. According to legend, Yu spent 13 years traveling the length of China, studying the rivers, dredging channels, building dikes, and creating systems to manage floodwaters. His success in taming the floods was seen as proof of the mandate of heaven, the divine approval that legitimized his rule. This connection between river control and political power became a recurring theme throughout Chinese history. The ability to manage the Yellow River, to provide irrigation during droughts and protection during floods, marked the difference between a strong dynasty and a weak one. When the river was managed well, agriculture flourished, trade expanded, the population grew, and the emperor's authority seemed unshakable. When the river ran wild, bringing destruction and famine, it was interpreted as a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, that his moral authority had weakened, that change was coming. The river also gave birth to a complex pantheon of water deities. Chief among these was Hebo, the Earl of the Yellow River, a god whose character reflected the river's own dual nature. In some stories, Hebo appeared as a benevolent figure riding through the clouds in a chariot pulled by dragons, bringing rain to parched fields and guiding boats safely to shore. In other tales, he was capricious and destructive, demanding tribute and sacrifice, taking what he wanted regardless of human suffering. One particularly dark tradition involved the marriage of young women to Hebo. In some regions, local officials claimed that the river god required a bride each year, and they would select beautiful young women from the villages, dress them in wedding finery, and cast them into the river as human sacrifices. This practice, which persisted in some areas well into the historical period, was often used by corrupt officials as a means of extorting money from desperate families hoping to spare their daughters. It took reformers like Shimen Bao in the Warring States period to expose and end these abuses, though belief in the river spirits themselves persisted. Beyond Hebo, the river was home to countless lesser spirits and supernatural entities. Water ghosts, or shui gui, were said to haunt the spots where people had drowned, lurking beneath the surface to drag down new victims so they could take possession of the living person's body and escape their watery prison. Fishermen and boatmen carried amulets and charms to protect against these malevolent spirits, and they performed rituals before embarking on the river, asking permission from the guardian spirits and promising offerings in exchange for safe passage. There were also beneficial spirits, guardians of particular bends in the river or specific pools, who could provide guidance to those who treated them with respect. Elderly villagers told stories of mysterious lights seen dancing over the water at night, of voices heard singing when no one was there, of boats that navigated through fog and rapids without visible hands on the tiller, guided by unseen helpers. These tales reinforced the sense that the river was not merely water flowing from one place to another, but a realm unto itself, teeming with invisible presences, a boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits. The river's importance extended beyond mythology into philosophy and art. In Taoist thought, water became the supreme metaphor for the way itself, the Tao. Water flows to the lowest place without effort, yet nothing can stand against its persistent force. It takes the shape of whatever contains it, yet retains its essential nature. It nourishes all things without seeking reward. In this way, water embodies the wisdom that the Taoist sage seeks to cultivate, a wisdom of flexibility, humility, and quiet strength. Chinese painters throughout the dynasties returned again and again to the Yellow River as a subject, attempting to capture its vast scale, its dynamic movement, its place in the landscape of both earth and imagination. Poets compose verses that compare the river's ceaseless flow to the passage of time, to the sweep of history, to the journey of the human soul through incarnations. The river became a mirror in which Chinese culture saw itself reflected, with all its contradictions and complexities. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 2,000 years ago, the Yellow River had already witnessed the rise and fall of multiple civilizations on its banks. It had seen the construction of the first sections of the Great Wall, designed partly to protect northern settlements from invaders who might cross the river during winter when it froze solid. It had carried the tribute barges of the Zhou dynasty, laden with grain and precious goods destined for the imperial capital. It had flooded and dried up, changed course and returned, destroyed cities and made new lands fertile, killed millions and sustained billions across the sweep of centuries. And it would continue this pattern, this cycle of destruction and renewal for millennia more. Even today, in the modern era of dams and flood control systems, the Yellow River remains a force that commands respect and caution. The Xiaolangdi Dam and other massive engineering projects have helped regulate its flow, but they cannot entirely tame a river that drains an area the size of France and carries sediment loads that can fill reservoirs in a matter of years. The relationship between the Chinese people and their mother river continues, evolved but unbroken, as complex and vital as it has always been. It is against this backdrop of history and mythology, of reverence and fear, of intimate connection between a people and their river, that our story unfolds. For in every village along the Yellow River's 3,000-mile journey, in every town and city that has risen on its banks, there have been those who maintained a special relationship with the water, who served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, who kept the old traditions alive even as dynasties rose and fell and a modern world crept closer with each passing generation. These are the keepers, the guardians, the watchers. And this is the story of one such keeper, whose devotion to his duty illuminated the darkness like lanterns floating on ancient waters. Part 2. The Keeper's Origins. Wei Lin first saw the lanterns when he was 7 years old, in the autumn of his 7th year, during the Ghost Festival. He had accompanied his grandfather to the riverbank as dusk gathered, carrying a basket woven from river reeds. Inside the basket were paper lanterns, dozens of them, each one carefully folded and shaped by his grandfather's weathered hands during the long summer afternoons. Some were simple lotus flowers, their petals painted in delicate pinks and whites. Others were more elaborate, shaped like boats or houses or tiny pagodas, with windows cut from rice paper thin enough to let the candlelight shine through in warm, golden patterns. His grandfather's name was Wei Shun, and he was known throughout the village of Longwan as the Lantern Keeper, though this was not a title he had chosen for himself, nor one that carried any official authority. It was simply what people called him, what they had always called the eldest Wei, going back through generations to a time before memory. The Wei family had lived in Longwan for as long as anyone could trace, their modest house sitting on a slight rise above the river, positioned so that from the front gate one could see a long stretch of the Yellow River as it curved through the valley, wide and powerful, its waters thick with the sediment that gave it both its color and its changeable nature. Wei Shun was 73 years old that autumn, his back bent from decades of labor, his hands gnarled like the roots of ancient trees, his face deeply lined with the marks of sun and wind and the accumulated weight of responsibility. But his eyes remained clear and bright, especially when he looked at the river, and when he spoke of his duty, his voice took on a strength that belied his physical frailty. "Listen, little Wei," he said as they walked down the path from the village to the water's edge. "Tonight, I will show you something important. Tonight, you will begin to understand." Young Wei Lin did not fully comprehend what his grandfather meant, but he felt the solemnity of the moment. The sun had already slipped below the western hills, and the sky was that particular shade of deep blue that comes in the brief transition between day and night, when the world seems to hold its breath. The river stretched before them, its surface smooth in some places, choppy in others where hidden currents churned. On the far bank, perhaps a mile away, a few lights had begun to appear in the scattered farmhouses, small yellow points in the gathering darkness. They were not alone on the riverbank. A dozen other people had gathered there, some carrying their own lanterns, others simply standing in respectful silence. Wei Lin recognized most of them: village elders and shopkeepers, the woman who sold vegetables in the market, and her husband who repaired boats, the Buddhist monk from the small temple on the hill, and two of his students. They nodded to Wei Shun as he approached, and he returned their greetings with a slight bow, the kind of mutual acknowledgement that passes between people who share an understanding deeper than words. The 14th night is for preparing, Wei Shin explained, setting down his basket and beginning to remove the lanterns one by one. The 15th night, which is tomorrow, is when the gate between the worlds stands fully open. But tonight, we place the first lights. Tonight, we let them know we remember. He showed Wei Lin how to place a small candle inside each lantern, setting it carefully so it would not tip or scorch the paper. Then he demonstrated the proper way to light the candle. Using a long taper lit from the small ceremonial flame, he kept burning in a protected lantern he'd brought from home. This flame, he explained, had been kindled from the flame his own grandfather had passed him, and that flame from the one before, reaching back through an unbroken chain of keepers to the first Wei who had taken up this duty. "How long ago?" Wei Lin asked, his young voice filled with wonder. Wei Shin smiled. "Long enough that the story has become mixed with legend. Some say it was during the Tang Dynasty, when the great poet Li Bai walked these banks and wrote verses about the river spirits. Others say it was much earlier, in the time of the Han. But what matters is not when it began, but that it continues. We are part of an unbroken line, little one. When I am gone, this will fall to your father. And when he is gone, it will fall to you." The weight of this revelation settled on young Wei Lin's shoulders. His father had spoken of such things in vague terms, but hearing it stated so directly by his grandfather, here on the riverbank with the lanterns glowing softly in the deepening twilight, made it suddenly, undeniably real. He would be a keeper. It was not a choice or an aspiration. It was simply what he would become, as inevitable as the river's flow. One by one, Wei Shun placed the lanterns on small wooden rafts he'd prepared, each raft carefully balanced so it would float upright and steady. Some he set directly into the current, where they immediately began drifting downstream, their candles flickering but holding steady. Others he waded into the shallows to release, his old legs sturdy despite the cold water that swirled around them. The other villagers did likewise with their own lanterns, and soon the river glittered with dozens of tiny lights, a constellation of man-made stars floating on the dark water. But Wei Shun's ritual had only begun. From a second basket, he withdrew sticks of incense and began planting them in the soft earth along the bank, lighting each one from his ceremonial flame. The smoke rose in thin, fragrant threads, carrying prayers that Wei Shun murmured in a dialect so old that young Wei Lin could barely understand the words. It sounded like music, like the river itself speaking through human voice. Then his grandfather did something that made Wei Lin's eyes widen with amazement. Taking a small bronze bell from his robe, Wei Shun waded into the river until the water reached his waist. There, in the middle of the current, he began to ring the bell, 3 slow strokes followed by 3 faster ones, the sound carrying across the water with surprising clarity. And as the bell rang out across the darkening river, the lanterns seemed to respond, their flames growing brighter, their movement becoming more purposeful, as if invisible hands were guiding them. "We call to them," Wei Shun said when he returned to shore, water dripping from his robes. We let them know we have not forgotten. The hungry ghosts, the lost spirits, those who died in the river, and those who simply wander, seeking rest. We light the way for them to return, to visit for these brief nights when the veil is thin, and we light the way for them to depart again when the festival ends. This is the keeper's first duty, to maintain the balance, to honor the contract between the living and the dead. Wei Lin watched as more lanterns joined those already floating, released by other villagers from points up and down the river. The water became a river of light, a flowing pathway connecting the realms of the living and the spirits. And in that moment, the young boy began to understand the profound responsibility his family had carried across the generations. His grandfather had explained that the duty of a lantern keeper extended far beyond the ghost festival. It was a year-round obligation, requiring knowledge of the river's moods, understanding of the spirit world, and deep connection to the traditions that had sustained the people of the valley for millennia. The keeper needed to know when to perform certain rituals to ensure good fishing, when to make offerings to prevent floods, when to light protective fires during the dangerous times of transition between seasons. The keeper needed to know the stories, all of them, the tales of heroes who had battled river demons, of lovers separated by floods and reunited in death, of ancient emperors who had made compacts with the water spirits, of dragons who slept in the deepest pools and could be roused to terrible wrath if disturbed. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were repositories of wisdom, warnings passed down through generations, maps of the invisible world that existed alongside the visible one. The keeper needed to know the signs, how to read the color of the water and predict whether the river would rise or fall, how to interpret the behavior of fish and birds and insects, how to recognize when spirits were troubled or when supernatural forces were gathering. The keeper needed to know which herbs to burn for different purposes, which chants to recite during which phases of the moon, which offerings to leave at which sacred spots along the riverbank. And most importantly, the keeper needed to maintain the lanterns, not just during the ghost festival, but throughout the year. There were small lantern rituals at each new moon, larger ones at the solstices and equinoxes, and special observances for the birthdays of certain river deities recorded in the old calendars. The keeper's house always smelled of rice paper and bamboo, of the special oils used to preserve the lanterns, of the incense that accompanied every ceremony. Young Wei Lin learned all of this gradually over the years that followed that first ghost festival. He accompanied his grandfather on his rounds, watching and listening, absorbing the lore and the practices. When he was 8, Wei Shun taught him to fold the paper lotus lanterns. When he was 9, he learned the proper way to light the ceremonial flame. At 10, he memorized his first river prayer. At 11, he was allowed to release lanterns on his own during the smaller, monthly rituals. His father, Wei Huang, worked as a ferryman, poling a flat-bottomed boat back and forth across the river to transport goods and passengers. This was no coincidence. The Wei family's connection to the river ran through all its aspects, earning a living from the water while also serving as its spiritual guardians. Wei Huang had learned the keeper's arts from Wei Shun, just as Wei Shun had learned from his father and his father before him, back through the mists of time. But Wei Huang was often busy with his ferry work, and as Wei Shun grew older and more frail, it fell to young Wei Lin to assist with more and more of the keeper's duties. The old man recognized something in his grandson, a sensitivity to the unseen, an openness to the mystery that surrounded the river. Some people went through life blind to the spirit world, unable or unwilling to perceive anything beyond the material. Wei Lin was different. He sensed things. On the river, he sometimes saw flickers of movement in his peripheral vision that vanished when he looked directly at them. He heard voices in the water's murmur, almost but not quite intelligible, like conversations in a distant room. He felt presences, awareness that was not his own, attention from entities he could not see. At first, these experiences frightened him, and he tried to ignore them. But Wei Shun encouraged him to pay attention, to cultivate this sensitivity. The boundary between worlds is thinner for some than others, his grandfather explained. For those like you, like me, like all the keepers in our line, we can perceive what others miss. This is both a gift and a burden. It means we can communicate with the spirits, understand their needs, maintain the harmony. But it also means we can never fully rest, never completely close our eyes to the other realm. We walk between worlds, little Wei, always between. Wei Lin came to understand this dual existence. He attended the village school and learned to read and write, played with other children, helped his mother in the vegetable garden, participated in the normal rhythms of village life. But he also inhabited another reality, one where the river was not just water, but a living presence, where ancestors could be felt hovering at the threshold of perception, where certain stones and trees and pools held significance beyond their physical form. The other children sometimes called him strange, and as he grew older, he became more reserved, more solitary. He found it difficult to explain his experiences to those who had never shared them. How could he describe the feeling of lighting a lantern and sensing the gratitude of spirits drawn to its light? How could he convey the weight of standing at the river's edge during the dark of the moon and feeling the attention of unseen entities gathering in the shadows? But Wei Shen understood. In those years of apprenticeship, grandfather and grandson developed a bond that transcended normal family affection. They were fellow initiates in a mystery, companions on a path that few others could comprehend. On quiet evenings, they would sit together in the house, crafting lanterns while Wei Shun told the old stories, his voice rising and falling like the river itself. He told of the time when a great flood threatened to destroy Longwan, and the keeper of that generation, a woman named Wei Miling, had stood in the rising waters for 3 days and nights, burning incense and ringing the ceremonial bell, calling to the river spirits for mercy. On the 4th day, the waters receded, leaving the village untouched while settlements upstream and downstream were devastated. The people wanted to honor Wei Miling as a hero, but she refused, saying she had only done her duty, maintained the covenant between the Wei family and the river. He told of the keeper who had fallen in love with a river spirit, a beautiful woman who appeared to him in dreams and visions, who sang to him from beneath the water. This keeper, Wei Chun, had become so entranced that he spent all his time at the riverbank, neglecting his mortal family and his other duties. Eventually, he walked into the river one misty morning and was never seen again. But his lanterns continued to appear on the water for years afterward, lit by invisible hands, tended by the spirit he had joined. He told of the keeper who had discovered a plot by corrupt officials to sabotage a levee upstream, which would have sent devastating floods through the valley to enrich a rival province. This keeper, Wei Jun, had exposed the plot, even though doing so cost him his life at the hands of assassins. But the levee was repaired, the valley was saved, and Wei Jun's spirit was said to still patrol that section of the river, vigilant against those who would harm the people he had died protecting. These stories, and hundreds more, formed the education of a keeper. They taught the principles that govern the duty: selflessness, vigilance, respect for both human and spirit, understanding that some things mattered more than individual life or comfort. The keeper was not a priest, exactly, nor a shaman, nor a government official. The keeper was something unique to the Yellow River and its long history, a living bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, a maintainer of old compacts, a tender of light in darkness. When Wei Lin turned 50, Part 3, The Lantern's First Light. The lanterns Wei Lin crafted were not mere decorations, though they were indeed beautiful. Each one represented hours of careful work, a meditation in paper and light. He made them in the traditional way his grandfather had taught him, using techniques passed down through generations of keepers, methods that honored both artistry and spiritual purpose. The process began with the bamboo. Wei Lin would venture into the bamboo groves that grew in the hills above the village, carefully selecting young stalks that were straight and flexible, neither too green nor too old. He cut these with a special knife kept only for this purpose, a blade that his grandfather had inherited from his grandfather, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. While cutting, he would speak a brief prayer of thanks to the bamboo spirits, acknowledging that he was taking life to serve life, receiving a gift to create gifts. Back in his workshop, a room attached to the side of his house that faced the river, Wei Lin would split the bamboo into thin strips, soaking some in water to make them pliable, heating others over controlled fires to create curves and joints. His hands moved with practiced precision, shaping the bamboo into circular frames for lotus lanterns, square frames for house-shaped lanterns, boat-shaped frames for the lanterns meant to carry the spirits of those who had drowned. The paper came next. Wei Lin used special rice paper, thin enough to let candlelight shine through, but sturdy enough to resist the river's spray and the evening breeze. He would cut the paper into precise shapes, painting some with delicate designs using brushes made from rabbit hair and inks he mixed himself from soot and plant dyes. Some lanterns he painted with lotus flowers, symbols of purity rising from muddy water. Others he decorated with fish, representing abundance and the souls of the departed swimming in the afterlife. Still others bore written characters, prayers and blessings, and names of ancestors. The painting required a steady hand and deep concentration. Wei Lin would enter a meditative state while working, his breathing synchronized with the motion of the brush, his mind emptied of all thoughts except the image he was creating. In this state, he sometimes felt that he was not merely painting decorations, but creating doorways, making portals through which spirits could pass from their realm into this one, attracted by the light and beauty. Once the bamboo frames were complete and the rice paper prepared, Wei Lin would carefully affix the paper to the frames using a paste made from rice flour and water, smoothing out wrinkles, ensuring that each panel was taut and even. Some lanterns were simple, just a single color of paper over a basic frame. Others were complex constructions with multiple layers, creating depth and shadow when lit from within. The most elaborate lanterns, reserved for major festivals or special occasions, might take weeks to complete, featuring intricate cut paper designs, multiple colors, and tiny details that revealed themselves only when examined closely. But the true magic of a keeper's lantern lay not in its construction, no matter how skillful, but in its consecration. Before a lantern could be released onto the river, it had to be blessed, imbued with intention and purpose. This was where Wei Lin's training as a keeper became essential, where the spiritual dimension of his work manifested. The consecration ritual took place in Wei Lin's workshop, always at dusk, that liminal time when the world shifts from yang to yin, from activity to rest, from the visible to the invisible. Wei Lin would arrange the completed lanterns on a low table, placing them in careful patterns based on their intended purposes. Lanterns meant to guide beneficial spirits sat to the east, the direction of renewal and dawn. Those meant to pacify troubled ghosts faced west, toward the setting sun and the land of the dead. Memorial lanterns for specific ancestors were arranged according to their birth dates and the elements associated with those dates in the Chinese zodiac. Then Wei Lin would light incense, usually sandalwood or jasmine, letting the smoke purify the space. He would ring the small ceremonial bell 3 times, the same bell his grandfather had used, its clear tone announcing to the spirit world that a ritual was beginning. And then he would begin to chant, reciting the sutras and invocations that charged the lanterns with their power. Some of these chants were Buddhist in origin, borrowed from the tradition of releasing lanterns during the ghost festival to ease the suffering of hungry ghosts. Others were much older, rooted in the shamanic practices that predated Buddhism's arrival in China, calling upon local river deities and ancestral spirits. Wei Lin had memorized dozens of these chants, knowing which to use for which purpose, understanding the subtle differences in their effects. As he chanted, Wei Lin would pass his hands over each lantern, feeling for a certain quality of energy, a resonance that indicated the lantern was ready to serve its function. Sometimes this happened quickly, the lantern seeming to glow from within even before a candle was placed inside it. Other times it required extended effort, repeated chanting, patient waiting until the spiritual charge built to sufficient strength. Wei Lin had learned not to rush this process. A properly consecrated lantern would float on the water with unusual stability. Its flame would burn brighter and longer than ordinary candles, and it would attract the attention of spirits who needed guidance or comfort. The candles themselves were special as well. Wei Lin made them from beeswax collected from hives in the mountains, mixed with small amounts of animal fat and scented with herbs. Each candle was hand-poured into molds, with a wick made from cotton twisted with silk thread. While pouring, Wei Lin would concentrate on the lantern's purpose, visualizing the light it would cast, imagining the spirits it would guide or honor or protect against. Different festivals required different approaches to the lanterns. During the Ghost Festival in late summer, when the gates of the underworld stood open and spirits of the dead could return to visit the living world, Wei Lin created lanterns specifically designed to guide these visitors. These were usually lotus-shaped, painted in soft colors, with gentle, welcoming designs. The idea was to provide a clear path for ancestral spirits to find their way to their living descendants' homes, where offerings of food and incense would be waiting. But these same lanterns also served to guide the spirits back to the underworld when the festival ended. On the final night, Wei Lin would release special lanterns onto the river, larger and brighter than those used earlier, and he would chant sutras of farewell and blessing, gently but firmly encouraging the visiting spirits to return to their proper realm. The lanterns would drift downstream, and it was believed that the spirits would follow them, drawn by the light, making their way back through the gates before they closed for another year. During the Mid-Autumn Festival, when families gathered to admire the full moon and eat mooncakes, Wei Lin created lanterns that celebrated the living rather than honoring the dead. These are often shaped like animals, rabbits and fish and birds, or like fruits and flowers. Children would help carry these lanterns down to the river, and their laughter and excitement created a joyful atmosphere that the spirits of place seemed to appreciate. The river on these nights felt less mysterious and ominous, more welcoming and benevolent. At the winter solstice, the darkest time of year, Wei Lin released lanterns meant to strengthen yang energy and encourage the return of light and warmth. These were typically red and gold, colors associated with fire and the sun, and they burned with particular intensity, their flames bright and strong despite the cold winds that often swept down the valley. Watching these lanterns drift into the long night, Wei Lin would feel a deep satisfaction, knowing he was participating in the cosmic drama of light's victory over darkness, warmth's triumph over cold, life's persistence despite death. But beyond these major festivals, Wei Lin maintained a practice of releasing lanterns every single night, a commitment that set him apart even from other keepers in other villages along the Yellow River. This nightly practice was not traditional in the sense of being required by ancient custom. Rather, it was something that had emerged in his grandfather's generation, a personal innovation that had proven so effective and meaningful that it had become central to the keeper's duty in Longwan. The practice had begun, according to family story, during a particularly difficult time for the village. A series of misfortunes had struck. Poor harvests, an outbreak of fever, drownings in the river, houses destroyed by fire. The people were frightened and demoralized, so beginning to wonder if malevolent spirits had cursed their home. Wei Lin's great-grandfather, the keeper at that time, had felt the spiritual atmosphere growing heavy and oppressive, like a storm gathering but never breaking. In response, he had begun lighting a lantern every single evening at dusk, releasing it onto the river with prayers for protection and blessings. At first, it was just one lantern, a simple lotus without elaborate decoration, but charged with all his skill and intention as a keeper. And slowly, over weeks and months, the atmosphere began to shift. The string of misfortunes ended. Crops recovered. The mood of the village lightened. People began to feel safer, more hopeful. Whether this was cause and effect or mere coincidence, Wei Lin's great-grandfather decided to continue the practice. It became his meditation, his daily discipline, his way of maintaining constant connection with the river and its spirits. And when he passed the duty to Wei Lin's grandfather, he emphasized the importance of this nightly ritual, describing it as the foundation upon which all the other keepers' work rested. Wei Shun had maintained the practice faithfully, and he had impressed upon Wei Lin its critical importance. The nightly lantern is like breathing, he had explained. You do not breathe only on special occasions. You breathe constantly, sustaining life moment by moment. The same is true with our work. The major festivals are important, yes, like deep breaths after exertion. But the daily lantern is the constant breath that keeps the connection alive, that reminds the spirits we have not forgotten them, that tells the river we honor our duty every single day without fail. So Wei Lin, from the time he became the primary keeper after his father's death, had maintained this practice with absolute dedication. Every evening, approximately an hour before full darkness, he would go to his workshop and select a lantern. Usually it was one he had prepared in advance, stored carefully in the wooden cabinets that lined the workshop walls. But sometimes, if he felt called to do so, he would create a new lantern specifically for that night, responding to an intuition about what was needed. He would consecrate the chosen lantern, even if it had been blessed before, renewing its charge and focusing its purpose on the present moment. He would light the candle inside using the flame from the keeper's eternal lamp, a small oil lamp that burned continuously in a protected alcove, never allowed to go out. This flame represented the unbroken continuity of the keeper's duty, and lighting each night's lantern from it reinforced that continuity, linking past, present, and future in a chain of light. Then Wei Lin would walk from his house down to the river, carrying the lantern carefully, protecting its flame from wind. The path was worn smooth by his nightly journeys, and he knew every stone and root, every rise and depression. Sometimes Yin would accompany him, walking in companionable silence, and sometimes their son Wei Feng would join them, learning through observation and participation as Wei Lin himself had learned. At the river's edge, Wei Lin had established a specific spot for his nightly ritual. It was marked by 2 large stones, between which a small altar had been constructed. On this altar sat an image of Hebo, the river god, along with smaller statues of protective spirits and ancestors. Incense holders stood ready, and a small gong hung from a wooden frame. This was Wei Lin's sacred space, the point from which he launched each night's light into the darkness. The actual release of the lantern was performed with ceremony, even though Wei Lin conducted it every night. Repetition did not breed carelessness or boredom. If anything, the daily practice deepened his appreciation for each moment of the ritual. He would place the lantern on a small wooden platform designed to float, a simple raft of bound reeds. He would light 3 sticks of incense and plant them in holders on the platform. He would ring the gong 3 times, and then he would speak the evening prayer. The prayer varied slightly from night to night, adapted to the season, the phase of the moon, the particular needs or concerns Wei Lin sensed in the spiritual atmosphere. But its essential elements remained constant: gratitude for the river's blessings, remembrance of the dead, prayers for the living, requests for continued harmony between the seen and unseen worlds, and a reaffirmation of the keeper's commitment to serve. As he spoke, Wei Lin would push the platform gently out into the current, watching as it caught the flow and began to drift downstream. The lantern's light would shine clearly for a few minutes, a warm glow moving across the dark water, reflecting off the ripples, creating shifting patterns of illumination. Sometimes it would float straight and true, carried by the main current. Other times it would spin slowly, or drift toward the shallows, or circle in an eddy. Wei Lin read meaning in these movements, interpreted them as communication from the spirits about the night ahead, about conditions in the invisible realm, about whether all was well or whether additional attention might be needed. Usually, the lantern would remain visible for 10 or 15 minutes before distance and the river's bends carried it out of sight. Wei Lin would stand watching until the last glimmer disappeared, using this time as a meditation, emptying his mind, becoming receptive to any messages or intuitions that might arise. And often, in these quiet moments, he would feel the river's presence most strongly, would sense the invisible witnesses who gathered each night to observe his ritual, to receive the light he offered. Sometimes he saw actual spirits during these vigils. They appeared most clearly in his peripheral vision, translucent figures standing at the water's edge or floating just above the surface. Some seemed to be watching him with interest or approval. Others appeared focused on the lantern itself, drawn to its light like moths to a flame. Still others seemed unaware of him entirely, lost in their own experiences, perhaps reliving moments from their mortal lives or working through whatever attachments kept them bound to the riverbank. Wei Lin did not fear these apparitions. His grandfather had taught him that most spirits were not malevolent, just confused or lonely or trying to complete unfinished business. The dangerous ones were rare, and even they could usually be managed through proper ritual and firm intention. The key was to maintain respect without showing fear, to acknowledge the spirit's presence without becoming entangled in their dramas, to offer light and guidance while keeping appropriate boundaries. There were nights, however, when Wei Lin sensed something more challenging. He would feel a coldness in the air despite mild weather, or notice an unusual thickness to the darkness, or hear sounds that made his skin prickle. On these nights, his nightly lantern served a protective function, establishing a boundary of light and positive intention that unwelcome entities could not easily cross. He would recite additional prayers, burn extra incense, sometimes stay at the riverbank longer than usual to ensure that whatever troublesome presence he sensed was pacified or driven away. The villagers of Longwan did not always understand or appreciate the full extent of Wei Lin's nightly practice. Some took it for granted, barely noticing the lantern that appeared on the river each evening as regularly as the sun setting. Others appreciated it in a vague, superstitious way, finding comfort in the knowledge that the keeper was maintaining his watch. A few understood more deeply, recognizing that Wei Lin's faithfulness created a protective spiritual atmosphere around the village, keeping it safe from supernatural harm, ensuring good fortune in fishing and farming, maintaining harmony between the human and natural worlds. Occasionally, someone would approach Wei Lin to request a specific lantern for a specific purpose. A woman whose husband had drowned might ask for a lantern to guide his spirit to rest. A family whose child had died might request a lantern to light the child's path in the afterlife. A merchant planning a river journey might seek a lantern for protection against water ghosts and other dangers. Wei Lin honored these requests, creating customized lanterns and conducting special ceremonies to empower them for their particular purposes. He accepted modest payments for this work, enough to help support his family, but never so much as to make his spiritual service feel like mere commerce. Through all of this, the nightly lantern remained the foundation. It was his constant, his anchor, his discipline. On nights when he was tired or ill, when the weather was harsh, when he had other obligations or concerns, he still went to the river and released his lantern. The practice had become so deeply embedded in his life that not doing it would have felt like forgetting to breathe, like abandoning a sacred trust. And the river, he believed, responded to this faithfulness. The fishing in the waters near Longwan remained good year after year. Floods that devastated other villages somehow spared his community or struck with less severity. Boats from Longwan seemed to navigate the treacherous currents more safely than those from elsewhere. Were these objective facts or confirmation bias? Wei Lin seeing patterns that confirmed his belief in the lantern's power? He didn't particularly care. The practice felt right, felt necessary, felt true in a way that transcended rational analysis. Sometimes, late at night after returning from the river, Wei Lin would sit in his workshop surrounded by lanterns in various stages of completion, and he would feel a profound sense of peace and purpose. He was doing what he was meant to do, serving a function that went beyond his individual existence, participating in a tradition that connected him to ancestors stretching back through time and forward to descendants not yet born. The lanterns were beautiful objects, yes, but they were also prayers made visible, intentions given form, love and memory, and hope transformed into light drifting on ancient waters. This was the keeper's art. This was the keeper's gift. And this was how Wei Lin lived his days and nights, one lantern at a time, one prayer at a time, one foot after another on the path between his house and the river, walking through the years as the river flowed through the landscape, eternal companions on an endless journey. Part 4. Spirits of the Current. The Yellow River in autumn held a particular quality of light that Wei Lin had come to recognize as sacred. As September turned to October, the heat of summer would gradually release its grip, and the air would take on a crystalline clarity. The water itself seemed to change, its muddy yellow-brown mellowing to something almost golden in certain lights, especially in the late afternoon when the sun hung low over the western hills. It was during this season, in the weeks leading up to the Ghost Festival, that the spirits became most active. Wei Lin could feel their presence increasing, like a tide rising not in the water, but in the invisible realm that overlapped with the physical world. The air itself seemed more alive, charged with attention, as if unseen crowds were gathering along the riverbanks, preparing for the annual time when the boundaries between worlds grew permeable. Wei Lin had encountered countless spirits over his years as keeper. Some had appeared to him clearly, almost as solid as living people. Others he had sensed only as presences, awareness without form, attention without eyes. Still others he had known only through their effects, through dreams they sent, through coincidences too perfect to be random, through feelings and intuitions that arose in his mind bearing information he had no normal way of knowing. He had learned to distinguish between different types of spirits, recognizing them by their energy and their interaction with the living world. There were the ancestral spirits, the deceased members of families who maintained connections to their living descendants, watching over them with varying degrees of interest and intervention. These spirits were generally benevolent, seeking only to be remembered and honored, perhaps to offer guidance or protection to those they had loved in life. Then there were the water spirits proper, entities whose existence had always been bound to the river, who had perhaps never been human at all. These included the followers and servants of Hebo, minor deities and supernatural beings who dwelt in the depths, who commanded the fish and the currents, who could be helpful or harmful, depending on how they were treated. Wei Lin had learned to approach these spirits with particular respect, understanding that they predated human civilization and operated according to rules and values that did not always align with human concerns. The hungry ghosts were different entirely. These were spirits trapped in a state of suffering, unable to move forward to reincarnation or to the peaceful rest of the ancestors. They had become hungry ghosts due to various causes. Dying violently or tragically, dying without proper burial rites, being forgotten by their living relatives, or accumulating karma that bound them to the earthly plane. These spirits were consumed by insatiable cravings for food, for recognition, for resolution of whatever attachments kept them bound. They could be pitiful or dangerous or both. Wei Lin's nightly lanterns served all these categories of spirits. The ancestral spirits appreciated the regular acknowledgement, the ongoing remembrance. The water spirits seemed to regard the lanterns as tribute, as proper recognition of their domain and their power. The hungry ghosts were drawn to the light and the prayers, finding temporary relief from their suffering, sometimes even enough relief to finally release their attachments and move on. One autumn evening, as Wei Lin prepared for his nightly ritual, he felt an unusual heaviness in the atmosphere. The sun had set, but full darkness had not yet arrived, leaving the world in that ambiguous twilight where perception becomes uncertain. He had selected a particularly beautiful lantern for the night, a lotus design with layers of petals painted in shades of pink and white, with golden stamens at the center. As he carried it down to the river, the air seemed to thicken around him, and he felt watched more intensely than usual. At the riverbank, he went through his customary preparations, lighting the incense, ringing the gong, speaking the evening prayer. But as he pushed the lantern out onto the water, something unexpected occurred. The lantern did not drift with the current as it normally would. Instead, it remained almost stationary, slowly spinning in place as if caught in an invisible eddy, though the water around it appeared to be flowing normally. Wei Lin watched with heightened attention, understanding that something was trying to communicate. He quieted his mind, opened his awareness, and waited. And then he saw her. She stood on the water about 20 feet from the shore, a young woman in a pale green dress, her long black hair unbound and floating around her as if moved by a current, though the evening air was still. She was looking at the lantern, and her expression was one of profound sadness mixed with something like hunger or yearning. Wei Lin recognized her nature immediately. She was a water ghost, one of the drowned, and she had been dead long enough that her features had taken on that slightly translucent quality that marks spirits who were fading, who were either moving toward reincarnation or dissolving into the river itself. Wei Lin did not panic. His grandfather had prepared him for such encounters. He stood calmly, acknowledging the spirit with a small bow, showing respect without fear. "You are drawn to the light," he said softly, speaking the words that his training had taught him. "You seek release from this place. I can help if you will allow it." The spirit's gaze shifted from the lantern to Wei Lin, and he saw her eyes clearly for the first time. They were dark and deep, holding a sorrow that seemed bottomless. She did not speak aloud, but Wei Lin felt her story unfolding in his mind, not in words, but in images and emotions that he somehow understood. She had been a young woman from a village upstream, betrothed to a man she did not love, a marriage arranged by families for financial and political reasons. Unable to face the future that had been decided for her, she had thrown herself into the river one night during the spring floods. The current had carried her body far downstream, past Longwan and beyond, and she had never received proper burial rites because her body was never found. Her spirit had been trapped in the river ever since, bound to the water where she had died, unable to move forward, forgotten by everyone she had known in life. The depth of her loneliness hit Wei Lin like a physical force. How long had she been alone with her sorrow? Decades, perhaps. Long enough that everyone who had known her in life was likely dead themselves. Long enough that her village might have changed beyond recognition. Long enough that she had become one of the forgotten, one of the multitude of spirits who existed in a liminal state between Earth and whatever came next. "I will help you," Wei Lin said with quiet certainty. "You do not need to remain here. It is time to let go, to move forward." Over the next week, Wei Lin performed a series of rituals specifically designed to assist this particular spirit. He created a special memorial lantern, painting it with images of mountains and clouds, symbols of ascent and transcendence. He wrote her story as he had received it, copying it on a fine paper that he then burned, sending the smoke skyward with prayers that her tale would be remembered even if her name had been lost. He made offerings of food and tea, placing them at the river's edge and inviting her to partake of the essence, if not the physical substance. Each night, when he came to release his regular lantern, he also released this special memorial lantern, and each night he saw the young woman's spirit waiting, watching, gradually becoming less solid, less bound to the water. Her expression shifted from deep sorrow to something more like peaceful resignation, and then finally to what might have been gratitude or even joy. On the seventh night, as Wei Lin released the memorial lantern, he felt a change in the air, a release of tension, as if something that had been held tight had finally loosened. The lantern drifted out into the current, and this time, unlike the first night, it moved smoothly and naturally, following the river's flow. The spirit appeared one final time, but she was barely visible now, just a suggestion of a figure, a shimmer in the air above the water. She bowed to Wei Lin, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude, and then she faded completely, and he knew she was gone, finally released from her prison of water and sorrow. This kind of encounter was not unusual for Wei Lin. Throughout his years as keeper, he had assisted dozens of spirits in finding their way forward, had helped release them from whatever trapped them in the liminal realm between life and death. Each case was different, requiring different rituals, different prayers, different kinds of attention and care. But the fundamental principle remained the same. The keeper served as a bridge, a facilitator, someone who could perceive spirits and communicate with them, who knew the proper rites and had the spiritual authority to perform them. Not all spirits were so easily helped. Some were too deeply attached to their earthly existence, too consumed by anger or grief or desire to let go. Wei Lin had encountered vengeful spirits who sought to harm the living, who blamed others for their deaths or their suffering and wanted retribution. With these, he had to take a firmer approach, using protective rituals and commanding them, by the authority of his position as keeper, to cease troubling the living and to submit to the natural processes that would eventually move them onward. He remembered one particularly difficult case involving a man who had been murdered near the river 20 years earlier. This man's spirit had become twisted by his anger, had become what the traditions called a Li Gui, a fierce ghost who actively sought to harm others. He would try to capsize boats, would whisper suggestions of suicide to depressed or vulnerable people who came too near the water, would cause nightmares and illness in those who encountered him. Wei Lin had been forced to perform a binding ritual, confining this hostile spirit to a specific section of the river and warning him that continued malevolence would result in his complete dissolution, his soul scattered and destroyed rather than allowed to proceed to judgment and rebirth. The ritual had been exhausting, requiring 3 nights of nonstop prayer and ceremony, assisted by the Buddhist monk from the village temple and 2 other spirit practitioners from neighboring communities. But it had worked. The hostile spirit had been contained, and over subsequent years, his anger had gradually faded, until Wei Lin could finally perform the rituals that released him to move forward, no longer a threat. These challenging cases were relatively rare, however. Most spirits Wei Lin encountered were simply confused or lost, in need of guidance rather than compulsion. Many were souls who had died suddenly or violently, who did not fully understand that they were dead, who lingered at the spots where they had died, repeating actions from their final moments, caught in a loop of incomprehension. Wei Lin would speak to these spirits gently, would explain their situation, would perform rituals to help them understand and accept their deaths. Often, this alone was enough. Once they understood, they could choose to move forward, to proceed to whatever judgment or rebirth awaited them. The lanterns served as beacons for these spirits, attracting their attention, giving them a focal point that could lead them out of their confusion and toward release. The water spirits proper, the non-human entities that inhabited the river, were different from ghosts. These beings had their own complex society and hierarchy beneath the waves, their own concerns and politics that occasionally intersected with human affairs. Wei Lin had learned to recognize their presence by the way the water moved, by certain patterns in the currents and the behavior of fish and river birds. When the water spirits were pleased, the river seemed more generous. Fishermen caught more fish with less effort. Boats moved more smoothly, finding easier passages through difficult currents. The river itself seemed more benevolent, less likely to flood or change course dramatically. Wei Lin understood that his lantern rituals were partly tribute to these spirits, acknowledgement of their power and their domain, maintaining good relations between the human community and the supernatural forces that controlled the river. But there were times when the water spirits became displeased or agitated. Perhaps humans had shown disrespect, dumping waste into the river or overfishing certain areas. Perhaps there were disturbances in the spirit realm itself, conflicts or power struggles that Wei Lin could only partly perceive. During these times, the river would become more dangerous, more unpredictable. Strange things would happen. Boats would encounter inexplicable problems. People would report seeing lights beneath the water or hearing music and voices when no source could be identified. When Wei Lin sensed such disturbances, he would increase his ritual activities, releasing additional lanterns, making more elaborate offerings, sometimes performing ceremonies that lasted through the entire night. His goal was to restore harmony, to address whatever imbalance had occurred, to remind the water spirits that the human community honored them and respected their power. One of the most profound spiritual encounters Wei Lin ever experienced occurred during his 40th year, on a night when the moon was full and the autumn air carried a hint of coming winter. He had gone to the river to perform his nightly ritual, carrying a lantern he had painted with images of cranes, symbols of longevity and transcendence. As he released the lantern onto the water, the surface of the river suddenly became smooth as glass, despite a breeze that should have created ripples. In this unnatural stillness, the water began to glow with a soft blue-green luminescence, and from the depths rose a figure unlike any Wei Lin had. Part 5. The Flood Season. The character of the Yellow River changed with the seasons, and no season brought more transformation than the summer flood season. From June through August, the river that had flowed relatively placidly through spring would swell with rainwater and snowmelt from the distant mountains, its volume sometimes doubling or tripling, its temperament shifting from benevolent mother to unpredictable force of nature. This was when the river earned its darker epithet, China's sorrow, and this was when the keeper's role became most critical and most demanding. Wei Lin had witnessed 43 flood seasons by his 60th year, and each one had taught him something new about the river's power and unpredictability. Some years, the floods came gently, the water rising gradually over days and weeks, giving people time to prepare, to move belongings to higher ground, to reinforce dikes and levees. Other years, the floods arrived with shocking suddenness, the rivers swelling overnight, breaking through barriers, spreading across the floodplain in a churning expanse of muddy water that carried away everything in its path. The spiritual dimension of the flood season was equally intense. The rising waters disturbed the river's spirits, agitated them, brought them closer to the surface of both the water and human awareness. Ancient entities that normally dwelt in the deep pools and underground channels would rise with the flood, their presence felt as a kind of pressure in the atmosphere, a heaviness that made sleep difficult and dreams vivid and often disturbing. The ghosts, too, became more active, their usual haunts inundated, forcing them to seek higher ground along with the living, creating an uncomfortable proximity between the dead and those who could perceive them. Wei Lin's responsibilities multiplied during flood season. The nightly lantern ritual continued, of course, but it took on additional significance. Now the lanterns served not just as spiritual guides and tributes, but as active protections, creating boundaries of light and positive intention that could help shield the village from the worst supernatural manifestations of the flood. Wei Lin would craft special protective lanterns, painting them with symbols of stability and safety, charging them with prayers for the village's preservation, releasing them onto the churning waters with the hope that they would help calm both the physical and spiritual turbulence. But beyond the lanterns, flood season required other rituals, older and more demanding. Wei Lin would rise before dawn on certain key days, determined by the lunar calendar and his own sense of what the river needed, and he would perform ceremonies at specific locations along the riverbank. These ceremonies varied in their details, but shared a common structure. Offerings to Hebo and the water spirits, prayers for mercy and restraint, sometimes specific negotiations or bargains wherein Wei Lin would promise increased tribute or special honors in exchange for the river, sparing the village from the worst of its fury. These negotiations were delicate affairs, requiring Wei Lin to walk a fine line between proper deference to powers far greater than himself and the confidence that came from his position as keeper, as a recognized intermediary whose word carried weight in the spiritual realm. He would stand at the water's edge, sometimes wading into the shallows, and he would speak directly to the river, addressing it as a living, conscious entity capable of choice and restraint. Great Hebo, Lord of these waters, hear your servant's petition, Wei Lin would chant, his voice barely audible over the roar of the swollen current. The people of Longwan have honored you faithfully, have maintained the sacred offerings, have remembered the old covenants. We ask now for your protection, for your mercy, that you might turn aside the worst of your power, that you might spare the innocent who dwell in your shadow. We acknowledge your might, we respect your domain, we offer these gifts in token of our devotion. And he would cast offerings into the water, coins wrapped in red paper, small jade carvings, bundles of incense, paper representations of horses and boats and houses to serve the river god in the spiritual realm. Some years, more substantial offerings were required, a pig or a goat, slaughtered according to ritual prescriptions and given to the river. Wei Lin performed these sacrifices himself when necessary, though they troubled him. He understood the symbolic importance, the way they represented the community offering something of genuine value, but he never became comfortable with taking animal life, even in service of protection against greater loss. The villagers watched Wei Lin's flood season activities with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Some truly believed that his rituals made a difference, that his intercession with the river spirits helped protect Longwan from disaster. Others saw the rituals as harmless superstition, comforting perhaps, but ineffective, with the village's survival depending more on well-maintained dikes and favorable meteorology than on spiritual intervention. Still others occupied a middle ground, unsure what to believe, but unwilling to risk abandoning practices that had been maintained for generations. Wei Lin himself did not trouble himself too much with questions of efficacy. He had seen things that convinced him of the spiritual realm's reality, had witnessed enough correlations between ritual and outcome to believe his work mattered. But he also recognized that the river was vast and powerful, that it followed its own nature, that sometimes it would flood regardless of any human intervention, physical or spiritual. His role was not to control the river. Such hubris would be both foolish and offensive to the spirits. But to maintain proper relationship, to honor the covenants, to do his part in the dance between human and natural, visible and invisible. In Wei Lin's 40th year as keeper, the flood season brought a test more severe than any he had yet faced. The rains that summer were relentless, starting in early June and continuing day after day with barely a break. The sky remained gray and heavy, and water fell in sheets, drumming on roofs, turning roads to mud, filling the rice paddies to overflowing. The yellow river responded predictably, rising steadily, its color darkening from tan to deep brown as more and more sediment was churned into the flow. By mid-July, the river had reached a level that troubled even the village elders who had seen many flood seasons. The water lapped at the base of the main dike that protected Longwan, and its current had become a roaring force, carrying debris from upstream, uprooted trees, pieces of buildings, sometimes the bodies of drowned animals. At night, standing on the dike, Wei Lin could feel the power of that water, could sense its desire to break free, to spread across the floodplain, to reclaim the space that humans had taken for their fields and homes. The spiritual atmosphere became oppressive. Wei Lin could see ghosts in broad daylight now, translucent figures wandering along the riverbank, driven from their usual haunts by the high water. Some were recent dead, victims of drowning from villages upstream where the dikes had already failed. Others were ancient, disturbed from resting places that had been dry for decades or centuries, now inundated by the unprecedented rise. They clustered along the high ground, visible to Wei Lin as a crowd of shimmering presences, their combined energy creating a buzzing pressure that gave him constant headaches. Wei Lin increased his ritual activities dramatically. He was releasing lanterns 3 and 4 times per day now, crafting them as quickly as he could and consecrating them with fervent prayers. He burned through his supply of incense and rice paper, sending his son Wei Feng to neighboring villages to purchase more. He barely slept, snatching brief naps when exhaustion overwhelmed him, but mostly maintaining a constant vigil, watching the river, sensing its moods, looking for signs of whether it would hold or break through. His wife Yin brought him food at the riverbank, knowing he would not leave his post long enough to return home for meals. She watched him with concern, seeing the strain in his face, the way his hands trembled from fatigue, the hollow look in his eyes from too many days of insufficient sleep. "You cannot hold back the river by yourself," she told him gently. Even a keeper is only human. I know, Wei Lin replied, his voice hoarse from chanting. But I must do what I can. The river is on a knife's edge. It could go either way. Perhaps my efforts will make no difference, but perhaps they will. I cannot risk doing less than everything possible. On the night of the new moon in late July, the crisis reached its peak. The river had risen to its highest point in living memory, and sections of the dike were beginning to show stress, small leaks appearing where the water pressure was greatest, the earth structure groaning under a weight it had never been designed to bear. The village leaders organized crews to frantically reinforce the weak spots, piling sandbags, driving stakes, doing everything humanly possible to prevent a breach. Wei Lin performed a ritual he had hoped never to need, one his grandfather had taught him but described as dangerous, as a last resort when all else had failed. It required him to enter a trance state through prolonged chanting and controlled breathing, to separate his spirit from his body and venture into the river itself, into the domain of the water spirits, to plead directly with Hebo for the village's salvation. He prepared carefully, instructing Yun and Wei Feng to watch over his body while his spirit was absent, warning them not to wake him no matter what happened, that his spirit would return when it was ready or not at all. He lit dozens of candles in protective circles, burned sage and sandalwood to purify the space, and then began the chant that would carry him out of normal consciousness and into the trance. The transition was both gradual and sudden. Wei Lin felt himself sinking, descending through layers of awareness, his breathing slowing, his heartbeat becoming distant and quiet. The physical world receded, growing dim and shadowy, while another realm came into focus, a realm of water and current, of flowing energy and ancient presence. He was in the river now, not his body, but his spirit, moving with the current, swept along in a rush of power and momentum. Around him, Wei Lin perceived the water spirits as luminous beings, some small as fish, others vast as dragons, all of them moving in complex patterns, dancing and swirling in the depths. They noticed him immediately, this human spirit in their domain, and some approached with curiosity while others regarded him with suspicion or hostility. Wei Lin projected calmness and respect, remembering his grandfather's teachings about proper conduct in the spirit realm. He called out to Hebo, asking for audience with the River Lord, invoking his position as keeper and the generations of faithful service his family had rendered. For a time, nothing happened, and Wei Lin worried that he would be ignored, that he had taken this terrible risk for nothing. But then the waters around him parted, and Hebo appeared, even more magnificent and terrifying than in their previous encounter, a being of such concentrated power that Wei Lin's spirit form trembled in his presence. "Why have you come here, Keeper?" Hebo's voice was the sound of rushing water, of currents colliding, of depths beyond measuring. "What right do you claim to enter my realm?" Wei Lin bowed low, showing proper submission. "Lord Hebo, I come to plead for my village, for the people of Longwan who have honored you across the generations. The river stands at the breaking point. If it floods, hundreds will die, thousands will be made homeless. I ask that you restrain your power, that you turn aside your fury, that you remember the covenant between our ancestors and yours." Hebo regarded him with eyes like deep pools, ancient and inscrutable. "The river flows according to its nature, Keeper. I do not command each drop, each current. I am the river's spirit, but the river itself is vast, is greater even than me. What makes you think I can simply decide not to flood? I do not ask you to violate your nature, great Lord. Wei Lin responded, choosing his words with utmost care. But I have seen you calm troubled waters, have witnessed your ability to influence the flow. I ask not that you hold back the river entirely, but that you guide it away from my village, that you turn the worst of the surge toward the empty floodplains rather than toward Longwan. This is within your power. And in exchange, I promise increased offerings, annual ceremonies in your honor, faithfulness maintained across the generations to come. The river god was silent for a long time, considering. Around them, the other water spirits waited, watching, their luminous forms pulsing with interest. Finally, Hebo spoke again. You are bold, keeper, to come here and make demands. But you're also faithful. I have watched your nightly lanterns across the years, have seen your dedication. Very well, I will do what I can. But understand this. The river's power is greater than my ability to direct it. I can influence, but not control. If the river breaks through despite my efforts, do not blame me. Do not believe the covenant is broken. Some forces are beyond even the god's command. Wei Lin bowed again, deeply, feeling profound relief mixed with remaining anxiety. I understand, great Lord. I ask only that you try. That is all any being can do. Hebo inclined his massive head in acknowledgement, and then dismissed Wei Lin with a gesture, and the keeper's spirit was suddenly rushing upward, rising through the water, through the layers of consciousness, snapping back into his body with jarring suddenness. He gasped, his eyes flying open, his heart racing as it had not been during the trance. Yun and Wei Feng were there immediately, supporting him, offering water, their faces showing the strain of their vigil over his motionless body. How long? Wei Lin asked, his voice barely a whisper. For hours, Yin replied. 4 hours you were gone from us. We were terrified, but we did as you instructed. We did not try to wake you. Wei Lin nodded, too exhausted to speak further. He allowed them to help him back to the house, where he collapsed in his sleep so deep it was like falling into a well of darkness. He did not dream, did not stir, simply rested in that profound unconsciousness that follows extreme spiritual exertion. He woke at dawn to the sound of excited voices. Rising on shaky legs, he made his way to the window and looked out toward the river. The water level had dropped, not dramatically, but visibly, unmistakably. The pressure on the dikes had eased. As he watched, the rain that had been falling steadily for weeks finally stopped, the clouds beginning to break apart, letting through shafts of early morning sunlight. Over the next 3 days, the river continued to recede. The dikes held. Longwan was spared the catastrophic flooding that struck other communities both upstream and downstream. People emerged from their houses cautiously at first, then with increasing relief and celebration as it became clear that the crisis had passed. The village leaders organized a feast of thanks. Part 6, Wisdom of the Waters. By his 70th year, Wei Lin had accumulated a lifetime of knowledge about the river, about spirits, about the delicate art of maintaining balance between the seen and unseen worlds. But knowledge, he had learned, was not the same as wisdom. Knowledge was the accumulation of facts and techniques, the memorization of prayers, and the mastery of rituals. Wisdom was something deeper, something that could not be taught directly, but only absorbed through decades of practice, through countless encounters with the numinous, through patient observation of patterns that revealed themselves only over long periods of time. The river had been Wei Lin's primary teacher. Not the river as mere water flowing from one place to another, but the river as a living presence, as an entity with its own consciousness, its own memory, its own teachings for those patient enough and humble enough to receive them. Wei Lin had learned to listen to the river, to interpret its moods and movements, to understand the messages it conveyed through the behavior of fish and birds, through the color and smell of its waters, through the dreams and intuitions it sent to those attuned to its frequency. One of the fundamental lessons the river had taught Wei Lin was about impermanence. The river was constant in its flowing, but never the same from one moment to the next. The water that passed under the bridge today would be far downstream tomorrow and would eventually reach the sea, evaporate into clouds, fall as rain on distant mountains, and perhaps centuries hence flow under that same bridge again in an endless cycle of transformation. Everything about the river embodied this principle of perpetual change within eternal patterns. Wei Lin had learned to apply this understanding to his own life, to the lives of the villagers, to the spirits he encountered. Nothing was permanent. Grief would transform into memory, memory into peaceful acceptance. Joy would fade, but leave behind gratitude and strength. Even the spirits, those entities that seemed to exist beyond normal time, were subject to transformation, eventually moving on to rebirth or dissolution or some other state that Wei Lin could not fully comprehend but could sense as part of the river's endless process. This awareness of impermanence had given Wei Lin a profound equanimity in the face of life's challenges. When difficulties arose, illness, financial hardship, conflicts with neighbors, the inevitable sorrows that came with living, he would remind himself that these too would pass, would transform, would be carried away by time's current, just as the river carried away fallen leaves and silt. This was not a fatalistic resignation, but a deep acceptance that allowed him to meet each moment as it was without being overwhelmed by clinging to what was pleasant or resisting what was difficult. The river had also taught Wei Lin about interconnection. He had learned that the river was not separate from the rain clouds, from the mountain snowpack, from the countless tributaries that fed it, from the ocean it emptied into. All were part of a single system, and changes in one part rippled through the whole. A drought far to the west would eventually affect the river's flow at Longwan. A flood in one region would send debris and displaced spirits downstream to regions that had seen no rain at all. Nothing existed in isolation. This understanding extended to the human and spiritual realms. The keeper's duty was not separate from the village's well-being, which was not separate from the river's health, which was not separate from the proper honoring of spirits, which was not separate from individual moral conduct. All were threads in a single fabric. Wei Lin's nightly lantern ritual affected not just the immediate vicinity of Longwan, but contributed to a broader pattern of right relationship that extended up and down the river, touching communities he would never visit and spirits he would never meet. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Wei Lin would sit by the river and simply observe, entering a state of receptive awareness where thoughts quieted and direct perception deepened. In these moments, he would sometimes receive flashes of insight, understanding that seemed to arise not from his own mind, but from the river itself, from the accumulated wisdom of the water spirits, from the consciousness of Hebo flowing through the currents. These insights often came not as words, but as direct knowings, complete understandings that appeared fully formed in his awareness. Once, during such a meditation, Wei Lin had understood something about the nature of time in the spirit realm. He perceived that what humans experienced as past, present, and future existed simultaneously for spirits, or at least in a way that was not strictly linear. This explained why spirits could sometimes perceive future events, why the dead could interact with the living across what seemed to be vast temporal distances. Time, Wei Lin realized, was like the river itself. Humans stood at one point on the bank and saw the water flowing past in sequence. But from above, from the perspective of a bird or a spirit, the entire river could be seen at once, source and mouth, and every bend between them existing in a single eternal now. This realization had profound implications for Wei Lin's understanding of his duty. The lanterns he released each night were not just affecting the present moment, but were somehow affecting past and future simultaneously, were part of a pattern that extended beyond linear time. The faithfulness of the keepers across generations was not just a series of individual actions separated by time, but a single sustained gesture, a continuous offering that all the keepers were making together, even though they lived in different centuries. The river had also taught Wei Lin about the necessity of both yielding and resistance. Water, the Taoists taught, was the supreme example of power through softness. It flowed around obstacles rather than trying to force through them. Yet, given enough time, it could wear away the hardest stone. Wei Lin had learned to apply this principle in his interactions with difficult spirits, with stubborn villagers, with the challenges that arose in the keeper's work. Sometimes the wise approach was direct action, firm resistance to harmful forces. But often, the better path was to yield, to flow around problems rather than confronting them head-on, to trust that persistent, gentle pressure would eventually achieve what force could not. He remembered a particularly instructive incident from his 40s involving a wealthy merchant who had built a new house along the riverbank, destroying a sacred grove of trees in the process. The spirits associated with those trees had been angry, causing trouble for the merchant and his family, nightmares, objects moving in the house, a general atmosphere of malevolence. The merchant had come to Wei Lin demanding that he control the spirits, threatening to report Wei Lin to government authorities if he did not immediately fix the problem. A younger Wei Lin might have responded with anger, might have lectured the merchant about the importance of respecting sacred places, might have refused to help someone who had shown such disregard for spiritual matters. But the older, wiser Wei Lin recognized that such a response would only escalate the conflict. Instead, he had flowed around the obstacle like water around a stone. He had agreed to help, had performed rituals to pacify the angry spirits. But as part of the process, he had required the merchant to make specific offerings, to plant new trees in a different location, to show proper respect and repentance. The merchant, desperate to end the haunting, had complied. The result was that the spirits were satisfied. The merchant learned a lesson about the consequences of disrespect, and a new sacred grove was established. Wei Lin had achieved his aims not through confrontation, but through flexible response, yielding in form while remaining firm in substance. This was the water's way, and it had proved effective again and again throughout Wei Lin's tenure as keeper. Perhaps the deepest wisdom Wei Lin had gained from the river was about death and what lay beyond it. Through his countless interactions with spirits, through his own out-of-body experiences during trance work, through decades of standing at the threshold between worlds, Wei Lin had come to understand death not as an ending, but as a transition, not as a wall, but as a doorway. The consciousness that animated the body did not simply extinguish when a body failed. It continued in some form, underwent transformation, moved into states that were different from physical life, but not necessarily inferior or less real. This understanding had given Wei Lin a profound peace about his own eventual death. He did not fear it, though he was not particularly eager for it either. He saw it as simply the next stage of his journey, the next bend in the river. When his time came, his body would return to Earth, but his consciousness would continue in whatever form was appropriate, would perhaps assist the next keeper from the spirit side as he had assisted the living from the physical side, would continue participating in the great dance of existence in new ways. He had tried to convey this understanding to others when they came to him grieving for lost loved ones. "Your mother is not gone," he would tell them gently. "She has only moved to a place you cannot yet see. The love between you remains. The connection remains. It has only changed its form." Some people found comfort in these words. Others could not accept them, needed the finality of absolute death to make sense of their grief. Wei Lin did not push. Each person had to find their own path through sorrow, their own understanding of the mystery. As he entered his 70s, Wei Lin began more actively teaching his accumulated wisdom to Wei Feng, who was now in his 40s and had been assisting with the keeper's duties for decades. But Wei Lin recognized that much of what he knew could not be taught in words, could only be absorbed through experience. He tried nonetheless, using stories and metaphors, trying to point Wei Feng toward the insights that had taken Wei Lin decades to discover for himself. "The river has no preferences," Wei Lin told his son one evening as they sat together crafting lanterns. "It flows where the land directs it. If we build a dam, it goes around or over or through eventually. If we dig a channel, it flows there willingly. It does not resist change, but also does not stop flowing. This is how you must be his keeper, responsive to changing conditions, flexible in approach, but constant in the fundamental commitment to serve." Wei Feng listened carefully, nodding, absorbing what he could. Wei Lin knew that his son would discover his own wisdom through his own experiences, would have his own revelations and insights that might differ from Wei Lin's. Each keeper brought their own gifts to the role, their own understanding and interpretation. This was as it should be. The duty was eternal, but its expression was always fresh, always adapted to the current moment, the current keeper, the current needs of the community and the river. Wei Lin also began recording some of his knowledge in writing, creating a manual of sorts that detailed the specific rituals and practices he had found most effective, that documented the major spirits he had encountered and how to interact with them, that provided guidance on reading the river's moods and preparing for flood seasons. He worked on this manuscript in the quiet hours before dawn and in the evenings after his nightly lantern release, writing by candlelight in a careful, precise hand, knowing that this document would become a resource for Wei Feng and for keepers yet unborn. But even as he wrote, Wei Lin was aware of the limitations of written instruction. The deepest truths could not be captured in words. They could only be lived, experienced, embodied. The manual would be helpful, would provide a foundation, but the real transmission would happen through the years of working side by side, through the example of Wei Lin's dedication and care, through the osmosis of values and attitudes that occurred when student and teacher walked the same path together over extended time. One autumn evening, as Wei Lin and Wei Feng stood together at the riverbank performing the nightly ritual, the older man had a vision. He saw the river flowing backward and forward simultaneously, saw all the keepers of his lineage standing along its banks, each at their own moment in time, but somehow all present together. He saw his grandfather Wei Lin, still strong and vital, releasing his lantern with careful precision. He saw ancestors he had never met, reaching back through the centuries, each performing their own version of the ritual. And he saw future keepers too, including Wei Feng and Wei Feng's children and grandchildren yet unborn, all the way forward to a distant future where the world had changed in ways Wei Lin could not comprehend, but where the essential duty continued still. In that vision, Wei Lin understood that his life's work was both infinitesimally small and infinitely significant. Each lantern he had released was a single drop in an ocean of service extending through time, yet each was also essential, irreplaceable, exactly what was needed in that particular moment. The wisdom he had gained through his years as keeper was both his own hard-won knowledge and also a transmission from all the keepers who had come before, whose accumulated understanding flowed through him just as the river's water flowed through any particular section of its course. When the vision faded and Wei Lin returned to normal awareness, he found tears streaming down his face, though whether from joy or sorrow or something beyond both, he could not say. Wei Feng looked at him with concern, asking if he was unwell, and Wei Lin smiled, shaking his head. "I am well," he said softly. "I am more well than I have ever been. I understand now, truly understand, what this all means." He did not try to explain the vision to Wei Feng. His son would have his own revelations in his own time. Instead, Wei Lin simply continued with the ritual, lighting the candle in the evening's lantern, speaking the familiar prayers, releasing the light onto the dark water, watching it drift downstream as he had watched thousands of lanterns drift before it. The simple, repeated gesture now held all the wisdom he had accumulated, was itself a teaching more profound than any words could convey. As the years continued and Wei Lin moved deeper into old age, the wisdom he had gained settled into his bones, became so much a part of him that he no longer thought about it consciously, but simply lived from it, embodied it in every action and interaction. The villagers who knew him could sense this quality, though they might not have been able to name it. There was a depth to Wei Lin, a groundedness, a presence that came from decades of standing at the threshold between worlds, from years of patient listening to the river's teachings. Young people sometimes sought him out for advice, asking about matters of the heart or ethical dilemmas or questions about their life's direction. Wei Lin would listen carefully, would sometimes offer thoughts, but more often would simply turn the question back, would ask them what the river would say, would encourage them to sit by the water and listen for themselves. "The wisdom is not mine to give," he would say. "It is there in the river, in the movement of water and time, in the patient wearing away of stone. All I can do is point you toward it. You must drink from that source yourself." This was perhaps the final and deepest wisdom Wei Lin had gained. That true teaching was not the transfer of information from one mind to another, but the awakening in the student of their own capacity to perceive truth directly, to connect with the sources of wisdom that surrounded them in nature, in silence, in the depths of their own awareness. The keeper's duty was not to be a repository of secret knowledge, but to maintain the living connection to the river and its teachings, to model what it looked like to live in right relationship with the forces greater than human scale. As darkness fell each evening and Wei Lin made his way down the familiar path to the riverbank, carrying his lantern with the same care, he had exercised for more than 50 years. He walked with the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime, with the teachings of the river flowing through his veins like blood, with the presence of all the ancestors and all the spirits who had guided him along the way. The path was worn smooth by his countless journeys. The river flowed as it always had and always would. And Wei Lin, keeper of the lanterns, walker between worlds, servant of the ancient covenant, continued his nightly ritual, each repetition both exactly the same and entirely new. Each lantern both a simple offering and a profound prayer. Each step along the path, both an ending and a beginning. Part 7. The Keeper's Legacy. The winter of Wei Lin's 78th year brought an unseasonable cold to the Yellow River Valley. Snow fell heavily in the mountains to the west, and even in Longwan, where winter usually meant merely cool temperatures and occasional frost, the ground froze solid and ice formed along the river's edges. Wei Lin moved more slowly now, his joints stiff with age and the cold, his breath visible in white puffs as he made his way down to the water each evening. Wei Feng worried about his father, tried to convince him to rest more, to let the younger man handle all the nightly rituals. But Wei Lin was stubborn in this. "I can still walk," he would say. "I can still light a lantern. While I draw breath, I will do my duty." There was no arguing with him when he took that tone, and Wei Feng knew better than to try. Instead, he simply accompanied his father on these cold nights, ready to assist if needed, respecting the old man's determination while standing close enough to catch him if he stumbled. But Wei Lin was thinking about succession now in ways he had not previously. He felt the weight of his years, felt the life force growing dimmer in his old body, knew without needing to be told that his time as active keeper was approaching its end. The knowledge did not frighten him. He had long since made peace with mortality, but it did make him reflective, contemplative about what he would leave behind, about how to ensure the tradition continued with strength into the next generation and beyond. Wei Feng was ready, had been ready for years. He knew all the rituals, had mastered the art of lantern making, could read the river's moods almost as well as Wei Lin himself. He had developed his own relationship with Hebo and the water spirits, his own style of conducting the ceremonies. When the transition came, it would be smooth, natural, exactly as it should be. But Wei Lin wanted to give his son something more than just technical knowledge, more than memorized prayers and practice techniques. One evening, after releasing the nightly lantern, Wei Lin asked Wei Feng to sit with him on the large flat stone at the water's edge, the stone where Wei Lin's grandfather had sat so many decades ago, where Wei Lin had listened as a child to the old stories and teachings. The night was clear and bitterly cold, stars sharp as ice crystals in the black sky, the river murmuring its eternal song as it flowed past their perch. "I want to tell you about the keeper's true duty," Wei Lin began, his voice rough with age, but still carrying authority. "Not the rituals, which you already know, but the essence, the heart of what it means to be keeper." Wei Feng pulled his coat tighter against the cold and settled in to listen, knowing his father had something important to impart. "When I was young," Wei Lin continued, "I thought the keeper's role was to serve the spirits, to maintain the rituals, to protect the village from supernatural harm. And these things are true, are part of the duty, but they are not the heart of it. The heart of being keeper is to remember." He paused, looking out at the dark water, at the lantern drifting downstream, its light growing smaller but still visible. "We live in a world that is always rushing forward, always forgetting, always discarding the old in pursuit of the new. People die, and within a generation or two, they are forgotten, their lives and stories lost. Sacred places are destroyed to make room for houses or roads. Ancient knowledge is dismissed as superstition. The young mock the ways of their elders, thinking themselves wiser for their rejection of tradition. Wei Feng nodded. He had seen this tension in the village, the younger generation often skeptical of the old ways, eager to embrace modernity and efficiency over ritual and remembrance. The keeper stands against this forgetting, Wei Lin said with quiet intensity, not in a spirit of stubbornness or blindness to necessary change, but in recognition that some things must not be lost. The dead must be remembered, or they truly die. The spirits must be acknowledged, or the connection between worlds severs. The old covenants must be honored, or the balance fails. This is what we do when we light our lanterns each night. We say, I remember. We remember. You are not forgotten. He turned to look at Wei Feng directly, his old eyes still bright in the starlight. When I am gone, when I have joined the ancestors, you will light lanterns for me. And more importantly, you will continue lighting lanterns for all those who have no one left to remember them. This is the keeper's greatest service. This is why the duty matters, why it must continue generation after generation. We are the memory of the river, the voice that speaks for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Wei Feng felt the weight of these words settling into him, understood that his father was giving him not just instruction, but a kind of spiritual inheritance, a framework for understanding the deeper meaning of the work they did. Over the following weeks, Wei Lin shared more of these insights with Wei Feng, often while they worked together making lanterns or during the evening rituals. He spoke about the importance of maintaining beginner's mind, of approaching each lantern as if it were the first, never allowing routine to dull the awareness that each gesture mattered, each prayer had power. He spoke about the delicate balance between confidence and humility, the need to act with authority when dealing with spirits, while never forgetting that the keeper was servant, not master, intermediary, not controller. He shared specific experiences, particular encounters with spirits that had taught him important lessons. The time he had met the spirit of a child who had drowned, and how helping that innocent soul move on had broken his heart, but also shown him the profound importance of the keeper's role in facilitating transitions. The time he had been tested by a powerful but malicious entity that had tried to intimidate him into abandoning his post, and how he had discovered the strength that came from decades of daily practice, from roots that went deep into tradition and duty. Wei Lin also spoke about the loneliness of the keeper's path. There will be times, he told Wei Feng, when no one understands what you do, when you are mocked or dismissed, when you question whether any of it matters. In those times, remember this: you are not alone. All the keepers who have come before stand with you. The spirits witness your faithfulness. The river knows your service. And the lanterns you light create ripples in the unseen world that touch more lives than you will ever know. But Wei Lin did not just want to prepare Wei Feng. He wanted to ensure that the tradition would continue even further into the future. Wei Feng's eldest son, Wei Chun, was now 15 years old enough to begin serious instruction in the keeper's arts. Wei Lin had been teaching the boy informally for years, allowing him to help with simple tasks, telling him stories, gradually exposing him to the spiritual dimensions of the work. But now Wei Lin decided it was time for more formal training. He took Wei Chun through the same progression he himself had experienced under his grandfather's guidance, teaching him to fold the paper lanterns, showing him the proper way to light the ceremonial flame, introducing him to the prayers and chants, gradually opening his awareness to the spirit realm. Wei Chun proved to be naturally sensitive, able to perceive things that others his age could not see, and Wei Lin recognized in the boy the same gifts that had marked himself and his grandfather before him. One night, Wei Lin performed with Wei Chun the same initiation ritual his grandfather had conducted with him so many decades ago. Under the ancient willow tree, with smoke swirling and herbs burning, Wei Lin placed his weathered hands on his great-grandson's head and recited the keeper's oath, hearing the boy repeat the words with trembling voice, witnessing the moment when Wei Chen's eyes opened to fuller perception of the spirit world. "Now you see," Wei Lin whispered, tears of joy and nostalgia streaming down his wrinkled face. "Now you understand. You are part of the lineage now, part of an unbroken chain reaching back through time. Cherish this gift. Honor this duty, and when your time comes, pass it forward to the next generation with the same care and love that I pass it to you now." Wei Lin also turned his attention to documenting the tradition more thoroughly. The manual he had been working on for years was nearly complete, but he added to it now with renewed urgency, wanting to capture as much as possible while he still could. He included detailed diagrams of the lantern designs, copied out the full texts of all the prayers and chants, described the ceremonial procedures for various occasions, provided advice for dealing with different types of spirits. But more than just a technical manual, Wei Lin created a history, recording the stories of previous keepers that his grandfather had told him, adding his own experiences and observations, creating a narrative that would help future keepers understand the tradition they were joining. He wrote about the keeper who had saved the village from floods, about the one who had fallen in love with a river spirit, about the one who had been assassinated for protecting the people. He wanted future keepers to know they were part of a story larger than their individual lives. He also created a small shrine in his house, a dedicated space that would serve as the keeper's spiritual center for generations to come. He placed in it the ceremonial bell his grandfather had given him, the keeper's eternal lamp that had burned continuously for over a century, small statues of Hebo and other river spirits, and a manual he had written. This would be the heart of the keeper's practice, the place where each keeper could come to connect with the ancestors and renew their commitment to the duty. As spring returned and the ice melted from the river's edges, Wei Lin felt himself weakening. He developed a persistent cough that no medicine seemed to help, and he lost weight steadily despite his family's efforts to get him to eat more. He knew what this meant, recognized the signs that his body was beginning its final decline. The knowledge brought not fear, but a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness to be leaving the world he loved, the river he had served, the family he cherished. Relief that his burden would soon be passed to capable hands, that he would soon rest. But he was not finished yet. Through the spring and into summer, Wei Lin continued his nightly rituals, though now he often had to rest halfway down the path to the river, leaning on Wei Feng's arm for support. His hands shook as he lit the lanterns, and his voice had become thin and reedy when speaking the prayers. But he persisted, driven by the same dedication that had sustained him for more than 50 years as keeper. On the night of the summer solstice, Wei Lin asked Wei Feng and Wei Chun to accompany him to the river for a special ceremony. The sun had just set, and the sky was that deep blue of twilight when the first stars were beginning to appear. Wei Lin had prepared 3 lanterns for this night, more elaborate than his usual simple designs. One was for his grandfather Wei Shun, one was for his father Wei Huang, and one was for all the keepers who had come before, reaching back through the generations to the first Wei who had taken up this duty. At the riverbank, Wei Lin performed the evening ritual with particular care and deliberation, knowing this might be one of his last times leading the ceremony. He consecrated each lantern with extended prayers, charged them with all the spiritual power he could muster, and then one by one, released them onto the water. The 3 lanterns drifted out together, their flames bright and steady, forming a small constellation of light on the dark river. Then Wei Lin did something he had never done before. He removed from his robe a 4th lantern, one he had crafted in secret over the past weeks. This one was painted with scenes from his own life. The house where he had grown up, the river flowing eternal, his wife Yin standing at the door, Wei Feng and Wei Chun at the water's edge, and at the center, a single candle flame, simple and bright. "This is for me," Wei Lin said quietly. "For when my time comes, Wei Feng, Wei Chun, I charge you to release this lantern when I pass, to light my way as I have lit the way for others all these years. And know that even then, I will not be truly gone. I will be part of the river, part of the flow, joining the ancestors who watch over you and guide you still." He handed the lantern to Wei Feng, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. The younger man accepted it reverently, understanding the significance of this moment, the passing of the final responsibility from father to son. They stood together in silence, watching the 3 lanterns drift downstream, growing smaller and smaller until they finally disappeared around the river's bend. Then Wei Lin allowed Wei Feng to help him back up the path to the house, his breath coming in labored gasps, his old body trembling with exhaustion, but his spirit at peace. That night, Wei Lin slept deeply and dreamed of the river. He dreamed he was young again, standing beside his grandfather, releasing his first lantern onto the water. But as he watched, the lantern transformed, becoming his grandfather's lantern, and then the lantern of the keeper before him, and then all the lanterns of all the keepers, multiplying until the river was filled with light, a flowing pathway of illumination stretching from source to sea, connecting all times and all places in a single luminous current. When Wei Lin woke the next morning, he knew with certainty that his time was near. He called his family together and gave his final instructions, practical matters about the house and the business, but also spiritual guidance about maintaining the keeper's tradition. He blessed Wei Feng formally as his successor, placing his hands on his son's head and speaking the words of transmission that his grandfather had spoken to him. He embraced Wei Chun and reminded the boy to be faithful to the training, to be open to the mystery, to serve with whole heart. And then, on a warm evening in late summer, as the sun was setting over the yellow river and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, Wei Lin peacefully stopped breathing. His family was gathered around him, holding his hands, speaking words of love and farewell. And as his spirit separated from his worn-out body, Wei Lin felt himself lifted up, carried on invisible currents, moving toward the river that had been his life's companion and teacher. Wei Feng and Wei Chun, standing together at the riverbank that night to perform the evening ritual, both saw something that confirmed their belief in the tradition they served. As they released the special lantern Wei Lin had prepared, as it drifted out onto the dark water, they saw both of them Part 8. Eternal Currents. 5 years after Wei Lin's death, Wei Feng sat in the workshop his father had used, surrounded by the familiar tools and materials of lantern making. The room still carried Wei Lin's presence somehow, a quality of the air, a sense of being watched over by benevolent eyes. The keeper's shrine that Wei Lin had established stood in the corner, the eternal lamp burning steadily, casting soft shadows that danced across the walls. Wei Feng was now 53 years old, fully established in his role as keeper, having guided Longwan through 5 flood seasons and countless daily rituals since his father's passing. His son Wei Chun, now 20 years old, worked beside him, learning the craft as Wei Feng had learned it, absorbing the tradition through patient observation and practice. The work continued exactly as it always had. Every evening, as darkness gathered, Wei Feng or Wei Chun or both of them together would carry a consecrated lantern down to the river and release it with the appropriate prayers and ceremonies. The nightly ritual had not been interrupted for even a single day in over a century. Through wars and famines, through floods and droughts, through changes in government and shifts in culture. The lanterns kept floating downstream, tiny lights on an eternal current, maintaining the connection between worlds. But Wei Feng had noticed something in recent years, a slow but steady change in the village's relationship with the keeper's tradition. More young people were leaving Longwan for the cities, seeking education and opportunities unavailable in the rural village. Those who remained often had little patience for the old ways, seeing them as backward superstitions incompatible with modern thinking. The electrical grid had reached Longwan 3 years ago, and now the village was lit at night by electric bulbs, reducing people's sense of dependence on natural rhythms and traditional protections. Wei Feng wondered sometimes if the keeper's tradition would survive beyond his son's generation. Would Wei Chen's children still feel the call to serve? Would there be anyone in Longwan who could even perceive spirits, who would understand why the lanterns mattered? The thought troubled him, though he tried to maintain faith that what needed to continue would continue, that the river itself would ensure the preservation of what was essential. He had shared these concerns with Wei Chun, who had surprised him with the depth of his response. The tradition will change, Wei Chun had said thoughtfully. It already has changed over the generations, adapting to new conditions while preserving the core. But the river remains. The spirits remain. As long as the yellow river flows, there will be those who perceive its deeper nature, who feel called to serve as intermediaries. Perhaps not always in the same way, perhaps not always called keepers, but the essential function will persist. Wei Feng found comfort in his son's words, recognized in them a wisdom beyond his years. Wei Chun had developed a different relationship with the tradition than Wei Feng had, one that was more philosophical, more flexible, more open to reinterpretation. This might be exactly what the tradition needed to survive into an uncertain future. One evening, as they prepared lanterns together, Wei Chun asked his father a question that had been on his mind. Do you think the lanterns really matter? I mean, not symbolically or spiritually, but practically. Does our nightly ritual actually change anything? Wei Feng considered the question carefully before answering. I have seen things, he said finally, that convince me the work we do has real effects. I have seen spirits drawn to the lantern's light, have sensed them finding peace or direction. I have seen the river respond to our rituals during flood season, though whether that's coincidence or genuine influence, I cannot prove. But even if I had never seen any of that, even if I could not be certain the lanterns mattered in practical terms, I would still do this work. Why? Wei Chen asked. Because it matters that someone remembers, Wei Feng replied. It matters that someone maintains the connection, that someone keeps faith with the old covenants even when no one else does. The act of faithfulness itself has value, creates meaning, shapes reality in subtle but important ways. We light lanterns not because we can prove they work, but because this is how we honor our ancestors, how we serve our community, how we maintain our relationship with the mystery that surrounds us. The lanterns are prayers made visible, and prayers matter, whether or not we can measure their effects. Wei Chen nodded slowly, understanding. This was the leap of faith that the keeper's duty required, the commitment to serve even in the absence of certainty, the willingness to maintain a practice whose value could not be quantified or proven, but only experienced and trusted. As the years flowed past like the river's current, Wei Feng sometimes thought about his father, about the legacy Wei Lin had left. The manual Wei Lin had written sat in the shrine, consulted regularly by Wei Feng when he needed guidance on specific rituals or wanted to remember a particular teaching. The lantern Wei Lin had prepared for his own passing hung from the ceiling of the workshop, never used, kept as a memorial and a reminder. And Wei Lin's presence, Wei Feng was convinced, lingered in the workshop, by the river, wherever the keeper's work was conducted. Wei Feng had encountered his father's spirit several times in the years since Wei Lin's death. Not clearly, not in full manifestation, but as a sense of presence, as gentle guidance that arrived in dreams or intuitions, as a feeling of being watched over and assisted during particularly challenging rituals. Wei Feng took comfort in these encounters, knowing that death had not severed their connection. That Wei Lin continued to serve the tradition even from the spirit realm, adding his strength to that of all the ancestors who watched over the keeper's work. Wei Chen, too, reported sensing his grandfather's presence, and the boy treasured these moments, feeling connected to a lineage that stretched back through time, feeling supported by ancestors who had walked this path before him and cleared the way for him to follow. The tradition was not just about maintaining rituals, Wei Chen realized. It was about participating in a community that transcended normal boundaries of space and time, joining with all those who had ever served the river in a collective effort that spanned generations. One spring evening, as Wei Feng and Wei Chen stood together at the riverbank performing the nightly ritual, they witnessed something extraordinary. As their lantern drifted out onto the water, dozens of other lanterns suddenly appeared upstream, floating toward them in a luminous procession. But these were not physical lanterns. They were composed of pure light, translucent and shimmering, and they emanated from the spirit realm rather than the material world. Wei Feng and Wei Chen watched in awe as this spirit procession passed, counting more than 50 lanterns, each one tended by a ghostly figure they recognized as previous keepers of their lineage. Wei Shun was there, releasing his ethereal lantern with the same careful precision he had shown in life. Wei Huang, too, and keepers from further back, faces Wei Feng had seen only in dreams and visions, extending in an unbroken chain to ancestors so ancient their features were barely distinguishable, shadows of shadows, memories of memories. The spirit lanterns passed in silence except for the whisper of the river, and as they drifted downstream, each one seemed to merge with Wei Feng and Wei Chen's physical lantern, charging it with accumulated power and blessing, infusing it with the spiritual energy of all the keepers who had ever served. When the procession finally faded and normal vision returned, The single physical lantern glowed with unusual brightness, its flame burning with extraordinary steadiness as it floated away into the darkness. Father and son stood speechless for a long time after the vision ended. Then Wei Chun said softly, "We are not doing this alone. We have never been alone." "No," Wei Feng agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "The tradition lives because all of us carry it together, the living and the dead, those who came before and those yet to come. We are drops in a river that flows forever." As Wei Feng aged into his 60s and Wei Chun matured into a man in his 30s, the pattern of succession continued naturally. Wei Chun married and had children of his own, 2 sons and a daughter, and he began their introduction to the keeper's tradition early, as Wei Feng had done with him, as Wei Lin had done with Wei Feng, maintaining the unbroken transmission. The world outside Longwan continued changing at an accelerating pace. China modernized rapidly, cities expanded, technology advanced, traditional rural ways of life came under increasing pressure. But in Longwan, by the Yellow River, the lanterns continued to float downstream each evening, their warm light a beacon of continuity in a world of flux, a reminder that some things endured, that some connections mattered enough to maintain across the generations. Wei Feng sometimes wondered what future keepers would face, what challenges they would encounter as the world transformed in ways he could barely imagine. Would there still be a village called Longwan in 100 years? Would the Yellow River still flow free, or would it be completely controlled by dams and engineering projects? Would anyone still believe in spirits, still sense the presence of the invisible realms? He could not know the answers to these questions, but he trusted that the tradition would adapt, as it always had, would find new forms while preserving the essential core. As long as the river flowed, as long as humans lived along its banks, as long as death remained a mystery and the boundary between worlds remained permeable, there would be those called to serve as keepers, to light lanterns in the darkness, to maintain the ancient connection. On a quiet evening in his 68th year, Wei Feng sat by the river at dusk, resting on the same flat stone where his father had sat, where his grandfather had sat, where countless keepers had paused to contemplate the eternal flow. The lantern he had released a few minutes earlier was drifting downstream, its light reflecting off the ripples, creating patterns that seemed to hold meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. Wei Feng felt the presence of all the keepers around him, a cloud of witnesses, a community of service that transcended time. He felt Wei Lin standing beside him, though he could not see him. He felt Wei Shun there too, and all the others, back and back through the generations, all the way to the first Wei who had taken up this sacred duty for reasons now lost to legend. And he felt the future keepers as well, Wei Chun and Wei Chen's children and children yet unborn, extending forward through time, an unbroken chain of light connecting past and future in the eternal present of the river's flow. They were all part of a single gesture, a sustained offering that had begun centuries ago and would continue as long as consciousness persisted, as long as anyone remembered, as long as the lanterns floated on the water, carrying their precious light into the darkness. The river murmured its endless song. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. And Wei Feng, keeper of the lanterns, guardian of the threshold, servant of the ancient covenant, sat in peace, watching the light drift downstream, participating in the eternal dance of remembrance and renewal, death and continuity, darkness and the brave small flames that refuse to be extinguished. This was the keeper's way. This was the river's gift. This was the tradition that endured, flowing like water from source to sea, from beginning to ending and back to beginning again, forever and ever, as long as the Yellow River ran, and as long as even one keeper remained faithful to light the way. And so our story, dear friends, ends like a lantern finally reaching the bend of the river and disappearing from sight. But as with all true stories, the end is also a beginning. For the tradition that Wei Lin served will continue throughout the endless journey of the Yellow River. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine those lanterns floating on the dark waters, carrying prayers and memories, illuminating the path between worlds. Perhaps you can feel the presence of those who came before you, your ancestors and loved ones watching your journey, sending guidance in dreams and intuitions, waiting for you on the other shore when your own passage comes. The wisdom of the Guardian is open not only to tradition, but to all of us. We can all light lanterns in our own ways, maintain our connection with the sacred, act as bridges between the visible and the invisible, the material and the spiritual, the living and the dead. We can all remember, we can all honor, we can all maintain our faith in the mysteries that surround us. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the Yellow River, for walking alongside Wei Lin throughout his decades of service, and for witnessing his devotion to the Guardian's duty and tradition. We, here at Mysterious Sleep Stories, are deeply grateful for your presence, for your willingness to explore these mystical paths with us as darkness falls and dreams begin to gather. If these stories resonate with you, if you find solace or inspiration in these nocturnal journeys, we ask that you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. Each story we share is meticulously crafted with the care and respect we have for the mysteries that surround us, designed to gently guide you into the realm of sleep and dreams. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? Are there any specific mysteries or legends you'd like us to explore in future episodes? Stories from your own culture or region that deserve to be told in this twilight space between wakefulness and sleep. Share your thoughts with us. We read every comment, and your contributions guide us on the paths we walk together through these mystical landscapes. Sleep well, dear travelers. The river flows forever. The lanterns shine in the darkness. And the keepers, passing their watch from generation to generation, illuminate the way, honor the covenant, and serve the mystery that surrounds us all. Remember that tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.